Good day, esteemed colleagues and Dr. Iab. I'm going to be talking to you about Mycobacterium bovis as a new emerging disease in lions. Now, emerging diseases have captured the public attention over the past several years, such as Ebola, avian influenza, MERS, and now the Zika virus. Such diseases pose a global threat to humanity due to our global transportation system, which can move diseases across in a matter of hours. However, people and their domesticated animals have been migrating from place to place and carrying diseases with them for centuries. But little to almost no focus has been placed on how new emerging diseases or old diseases that emerges in wildlife affect wildlife in the past decade. Now, Mycobacterium tuberculosis bovis, or BTB, has come from the Mediterranean 10 to 20,000 years ago and then spread to Europe and Africa. Now, in the 18 or 1900s, it was the most important infectious disease in killing millions of cattle and affecting a lot of humans. It was also known as the White Plague. Now, BTB was suspected to move into South Africa, especially the Kruger National Park, where it was noticed in the early 1960s, late 1950s, and it was spread unnoticed further then until about the 1990s. Now, the main maintenance hosts were in the past domestic cattle, but research have recently indicated that any ungulate can become a maintenance host for it. Now, in South Africa, the maintenance hosts mainly are in the wildlife, are the greater kudu and buffalo. Now, there also have been signs showing that warthogs, chacma baboons, and meerkats can also become maintenance hosts. Now, but it has now also been confirmed in many national parks in southern Africa that the disease is already present there. So, suspecting movement of wildlife by sails due to close proximity of cattle of the rural pastures have led to these situations. But now, in South Africa, it's a notifiable disease and has strict measures and control. Not the same for the rest of the southern parts of Africa, if I can say. Now, as I've mentioned, African buffalo and greater kudu have become the maintenance host, and they can spread to any one of our carnivores, such as the lion, the leopard, the cheetah, here in South Africa. Now, it can become a maintenance host in our lions due to their behavior and interaction that plays a huge role in the spread of the disease within it. And thus, due to the multiple species interactions and the epidemiology here in Africa, it has become a very complex disease within the ecosystems. Now, the rest of Africa, it is a huge threat, such as southern parts of it, due to their pastoral living, such as Botswana, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and those things. Now, there are large opposing views of BTB in wildlife populations, but a large percentage of the data and scientific research recently done has started to show it is a true, significant, and real threat to wildlife. It has become of greater importance here in South Africa due to our booming wildlife industry and the human interaction interface, which increases with habitat fragmentation and also people urbanizing wildlife and doing eco estates, nature estates, and those trying to live within their vicinities. Now, BTB is a complex and has a multiple drivers with multiple species involved, but BTB main method of transmission is usually via spillover or direct contact. Now, it can be via ingestion, respiratory systems, alimentary, and percutaneous. The ingestion is the main route here for the lions because they ingest the prized organs when they catch, and mainly the diseased animals, many of the times the weak, those that are caught. And they ingest the lungs and the lymph nodes and the organs mostly with the male lions because it's the prized organs, like I mentioned. Now, respiratory spread can happen amongst the group of the lions because they have a very social structure. Alimentary also plays a large role because when they've ingested it, they can take it in. And then, of course, percutaneous. When these lions are fighting, it makes a huge thing. Now, a maintenance host only develops when a sufficient intraspecies transmission of the infection occurs. And at this point, it's uncertain for lions, but it's leaning towards the situation that they've become maintenance hosts. Now, individual factors play a role in BTB spread amongst the lions, such as the excretion potential, the mortality rate of the animal, the dose, the route of the infection of the disease. And here, with lions, it is a slow, progressive, debilitating disease, and that's making it very problematic to determine the full effect on the populations of the lions. Now, BTB in lions, clinical signs differ greatly compared to other species. Now, in other species, you see many of the times the marked emaciation, some of the cases you do see, such as the picture on the right, and then initially the lungs are affected, also second picture, and then the lymph nodes of these animals may be enlarged, but in lions you don't see it. They have slow healing wounds, which in lions is they've got a poor dull coat, and many of the times in the very fast steps of the disease, they have started coughing and having difficulty breathing. Now, the initial lesions in the lungs are non-descriptive nodules of a few centimeters in diameter and bulge slightly above the pleural surfaces if you're doing a post-mortem. Now, lions suffer from BTB, often manifest as large cutaneous granulomas and arthritis, which is not associated to BTB usually. Now, the lymph nodes of the animals, as I've mentioned, is enlarged, but you cannot see them macroscopically. Now, many of the times this has led to the death of the major southern parts of Kruger National Park or the major lions in South Africa. Now, the impact of BTB on lions is mainly that tuberculosis endemic has a number of implications, for which the full effect might sometimes only be seen in the long term. So the potential negative long-term effects on the population dynamics is one, of certain social animal species is a greater effect. Now, the direct threat of the survival of endangered species pose particular problems for the wildlife conservationists. Now, as mentioned, the estimated prevalence is about between 71 and 80% of the southern parts of the lions, where the northern part is about 19%. And there's a mortality rate that's equivalent almost to that of buffalo, which is 11%. Now, the population dynamics due to research in that have shown that the genetic pool is decreasing by approximately 3% per year. This is going to lead to a situation where these animals are at critical stages of extinction. Now, due to the lions, the reason for them being so badly affected is due to their social structure and changes. The adult lions, males especially, first affect that eats the prized organs, the lungs, the intestines, the lymph nodes, as mentioned. And this is usually due to the collation of brother to brother or half-brother. Now, if the half-brother dies sooner, the other lion would most likely be killed. If the brother dies, or both of them die at the same time, it would just be taken over by another male lion coalition, and that leads to the situation. So there's a much shorter lifespan in the southern prides as compared to the other territories within Kruger National Park or even South Africa. These are seen within quite a few different parks. Now, surveillance, one needs to first say, is the animal dead or is it alive? Now, there's also how they determine the surveillance. Now, on dead animals, it needs to be confirmed by a culture. It's very easy or extremely difficult, depending on the post-mortem signs that are present at this point. Now, early detection is usually a presumptive diagnosis, and this is based on a comparative intradermal tuberculin test and an INF-alpha test. Now, this is the most reliable and most reliably used. Now, late detection is usually done by serology tests, and post-mortem clinical signs present supportive towards the diagnosis. But the most effective way is usually using these tests in combination. Now, in the live animal, on the other hand, in the past it was usually done by capturing the lions twice, 3 days apart, and then performing the intradermal TB skin test. But it came up that locating the animals again after capture was quite difficult, and many of the times one missed the period, and then you get false negative tests, which is not what we would like. The new method that was produced by Kruger National Park and researchers is called a gene expression assay. Now, this is very, very nice because the lion only needed to be captured once, and the test has approximately a sensitivity of 80.8 and 86.5, and a false positive you usually get around about 18%. Now, as the lions was considered BTB positive when 3 days on the intradermal test on the bovine, the skin swelling should have been about 2 millimeters. Now, imagine you've skipped it by about 2 or 3 days. You're not going to get the same results. Now, control is very difficult within the lions itself because you get captive situations, you get free-ranging wildlife situations, and that makes it quite difficult. Now, vaccines developed are quite expensive, but could end up being the key to protecting lions, buffalo, and other species that are now affected by BTB. This would not only help Kruger conservation efforts, but would also help ensuring that bovine tuberculosis doesn't continue to spread throughout further wildlife within the southern parts of Africa and escape wildlife possibly back and a spill back or a spill over back into the cattle herds. Now, there are usually multiple species and multiple maintenance sites, which makes this vaccine situation quite difficult. Now, in a captivity situation, it has a total different dynamic compared to the wild multiple species control situation. Captivity, one can either slaughter these animals or cull these animals out and then replace them with bovine tuberculosis free animals. But in the wild situation, one can't do this to a whole pride because you don't know what the initial exposure is to the whole group, which makes quite strategies to manage and control the disease should be based on adequate data relevant to the disease in the specific area. They should be scientifically sound, and there should be a good reason to believe the outcome will be successful. Ability to infect multiple hosts in the same ecosystem and the spread of the infection to the species create a major difficulty to eliminate the disease from such an ecosystem, such as in the wild, the free-ranging ones, particularly because it's unknown how many of these animals in the system has become infected and how many act as maintenance hosts. Now, disease modeling on the spread helped indicating towards data and a surveillance-dependent situation leads to a predictive spread of the disease that could assist in the control. Now, Kruger National Park has a seasonal culling program on buffalo and monitoring of the lions, and usually culling only the lions that have severe illness and then doing post-mortem tests on the surveillance that was previously mentioned. But culling of lions has quite a difficult situation due to their genetic, monetary, and ecosystem service values, and there's a hierarchy within the ecosystem that they play. If you remove them, it changes the whole ecosystem. And then, of course, the opinion of society pertaining to the management and culling is quite a dramatic situation. So you have major impacts on whether control measures can be implemented or not. Now, control and management can also focus on the management situations within the Kruger National Park, which was implemented in many of the other parks and areas within Southern Africa. And this leads to a completed intervention which must be agreed upon by all stakeholders. Now, there's a new, like I've mentioned earlier, the modeling of the disease dynamics in the population. Now, the modeling is called an approximate Bayesian computation modeling framework, which can address complex diseases within a system without specifying all the specific parameters. So one is relying on some educated professional guesses. Surveillance and data collection will lead to an eventual effect on the species within that system. The success or failure of the application of the management and control mechanisms and the cost-benefit analysis determination towards that model. Now, other countries like Australia was successful in eradicating bovine TB from the wildlife and the hosts such as the water buffalo. New Zealand authorities implemented the same management procedure to eradicate bovine tuberculosis. Both these countries could follow the route since the wildlife species were both introduced in that area and there weren't massive intrinsic value. But this is not the case for South Africa, for instance, where African buffaloes and other susceptible species have a high intrinsic value and culling is not necessarily an acceptable option for the public or the researchers. Now, they have a seasonal culling program, but it's only to curtail the effect of BTB in lions. Culling on a regular basis reduces the prevalence of the disease, and it was done in Msluwi Game Reserve, but it had a good success there, but the vaccination also didn't prove that. Now, you've got population genetic management, which one's got to consider, and then breeding of these lions to try and control and manage it is not due to the fact the animals can't adapt. Physical separation, not an option here in the free-ranging countries such as Africa. Unlikely it is to be eradicated from South Africa very quickly or even from our parks. Now, some One Health aspects that I'd like to mention is lions is an apex predator, so it affects the biodiversity and the composition of the ecosystem greatly. Now, ecotourism affecting the socioeconomics of a park and communities running and working in these parks. There's also the bushmeat and illegal trade, which also presents a risk to the humans. At this point, they're killing lions, taking their parts, and then trying to sell in Asia and those places. Now, these weak animals see humans and livestock now as prey and increases the danger. So that's another aspect. Now, BTB affects the health of the whole ecosystem by introducing it back into domestic animals, towards the wildlife, and back to the humans. An important future challenge is to determine the key transmission mechanisms maintaining the persistence of the different types of the disease in the wild. Upgrading it to the ISA to a more vulnerable state is something that needs to be strongly considered. One can look at these things. There's a power dramatical influence of the dynamics of lion species on the populations. The risk of spillover or spillback of the infection to neighboring communities and cattle rises a concern about human health and wild stock. As you have a look at this, you'll see there's a wildlife emerging diseases, human and domestic, and there's arrows pointing in both ways, indicating that it can happen to those sites. In conclusion, it's an old disease that can become a new threat to lions and to any other animal. VTB truly holds threats to lions and other species.